Washington State Cougars, David Riley in his second year uh, at Washington State, and this team is in a very different spot than it was, I would say, a year ago. Last year, a lot of familiar faces for Riley on his roster, a lot of guys he brought over from Eastern Washington, and they hit the ground running. They were really good early on. They did lose Cedric Howard after the first 6 games, which really crippled their chances throughout the course of the season. But this was a team that looked like it was a tournament quality team through the first month and a half of the season. And then after injury, after injury, after injury, the wheels did finally come off during conference play. This is a team, they lost both the matchups to Pacific. They really they got some early games. They beat USF. They were able to kind of push St. Mary's to the limit up at the Palouse, but it kind of wore on them, just the lack of depth that they had. And going into this year, we know that's going to be kind of a point of emphasis, but also, can they continue with the style of play that David Riley wanted them to have last year? We know they wanted to play up tempo. They want to play fast. And we saw it in year one, and it worked really well up until the point where they just did not have enough horses to run it. This year, they have some good pieces on this roster. What's your kind of look at this Washington State team as they enter their final year in the WCC?
Yeah, like you mentioned, lots of explosiveness last year. And I think that's not just limited to the limited games you saw Cedric Howard play. Obviously, Lamont Watts, Isaiah Watts at times, and even though a very controversial figure at times, Nate Calmisa sometimes was very capable. But you looked at the downsides of that. You mentioned that where for as good as they played against USF St. Mary's, they got taken to the woodshed at home by Gonzaga, gave up to this day, I think they're still making threes in Santa Clara. That kind of like the variance was so high with Washington State last year. I think the variance will be lower this season for Washington State. But for me, the one thing that I kind of want to see play out, because this was just my initial gut feeling once I saw the roster and kind of how it plays out compared to what David Riley wants. There was explosiveness, but not a lot of mental toughness last year. I wonder if they've course corrected almost too much, and that, yeah, they'll be a tough team and they'll be a tougher out in terms of a play-to-play basis, but they may not be as explosive as they want to be. So that's the one thing. Kind of, I don't want to say growth because they haven't played a game yet, but it's an area that I want to see answered, because you look at guys who they added. Emmanuel Ugbo, very capable guy. You bring back Ndie Okafor, very capable guy. But then you look at the guards, because the guards are the engine of what that up-tempo like offense is. And you have guys you brought back, Tomas Thrasherson, Richard Zvavers, and then you got the guys backing up, and Case Wynot for to bring through. I just don't know if they're going to have the horses in terms of the top end to get to do that effectively. I think they'll have a better floor in terms of they're not going to let the rope go as much as they did last year under those circumstances. But I'm not sure they're going to get what they want in terms of their ceiling, and especially what it looks like in terms of the best version of David Riley basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it does appear that the athleticism which we saw from the team a year ago is not necessarily the athleticism we're going to see from this year's team. The one, I think, really interesting piece to me is Meli Yalaho. Like, he's the one coming over from Texas Tech that I think has a lot of there's a lot of Lawan Watts, like a potential there. And I think that if he can find his footing and really kind of like figure things out, he's one I think that can really kind of have that breakout in a David Riley system. Even looking at certain guys like Jerome Morton coming over from Morehead State, this was someone who shot 37% from three, going to get plenty of opportunities to shoot from three in this offense, the way they run it. So I do think that there's at least some optimism that this can work with the pieces that they have. But I do think it has to be a little bit different, because one of the challenges, and Oregon State, I think, course corrected on this as well with their recruit this year, is that they got bigger, they got stronger, and because this is a league where the small mistakes can kill you, that you have to find guys who are going to limit those mistakes, do the little things right, because that a lot of times is how you win in this league. You see that obviously that's what Gonzaga does. In addition to obviously everything else they do really well. St. Mary's does that. USF does that. Santa Clara does that. LMU has gotten better at that. I think they were best in the league in turnovers outside of St. Mary's. Like they were one of the best in ball control a year ago. So you see like that the teams who do well in this league are those who limit the mistakes, and they also rebound well. They are bigger, and that was something else that Washington State needed to do as well. Like they were not a terribly big team. Like, the two guys, like Dane Erikstrup and this Ethan Price were two guys like obviously two really good bigs, but they were kind of more outside in as opposed to inside out. And that is something that isn't exactly something that works in the long term in the WCC. We don't see too many. You still have to have the guy inside. You still have to have that solid interior presence. And Andy Okafor is one of those guys who can bring that. He needs to be more consistent. He needs to be able to stay on the floor longer to be able to help them with that. But that's part of, I think, what they've had to kind of reconstruct. And with Washington State, this is a team that just feels like they've done some work on that front, but it's still building toward what is going to be ideal in a David Riley system.
Yeah, because you kind of look at it from a certain sense, and I saw a little bit of Dave Riley when he was at Eastern Washington. You kind of see how the vision comes together when Ethan Price was over there, Cedric Coward was over there, and a guy who Washington State won't be getting back this year, but I believe he's back next year, and Casey Jones from his mission trip. Washington State, like the current center, like our big man structures, the stands, it's Andy Okafor, the transfer Simon Hildebrand, and then the freshman Dominic Robinson. I don't think you can really rely on a guy like Dominic Robinson just yet. I think he's a little bit time away. But then you kind of see, is it just going to be Hildebrand backing up at the 5? Is it maybe slide him to the 4, see what he kind of brings to the table? Not so sure kind of how they want to split the dynamics that way. Do they fit Emmanuel Ugbo and just place him at the 4? Like I find Emmanuel Ugbo to be a very capable player and someone who just needs to continue to be consistent. That's one area where you just don't want to see him go absent. And I think if Washington State can uncork that, I think that'd be a major benefit for them. But when I look at all that, and it's hard for me to kind of understand how this current crop may come together, because I don't know that you have the right mix of explosiveness and athleticism mixed with the right toughness. I think you do. I think they're better in the department of toughness, but I do think they have, at least for the moment, on paper, regressed in the area of explosiveness and the ability to push the pace consistently with the right people. So, like you mentioned, there are guys who are capable of stepping up, but I do think it's important to stress that I think it's a little bit more of an unknown puzzle compared to a team like Oregon State, because you can see the vision. You got guys who are returning, and you kind of can see where they've been developing over the course of the years. Washington State, it's a bunch of young guys from last year that are returning, and aside from Andy Okafor, and now it's trying to see how does it all kind of like peg together in terms of trying to find the best version of David Riley basketball, because he does have a longer runway than a guy like Wayne Tinkle. And I think that's why maybe I'm kind of a little bit more judicious, I guess, so to speak, about what I see from this team, because we've seen the really good parts of it. So that's why maybe they get a higher burden of scrutiny compared to a team like Oregon State.
Yeah, again, in year one, it's also hard because it's like he was able to bring over a lot of his guys, so they all knew the system. They were able to kind of hit the ground running, and it made a lot more sense early on of how they were able to kind of really. It seemed a little bit more seamless the way they were able to do that. This year is different in that way. You don't have that core of guys that are completely familiar with your system, so there's I think going to be more growing pains this year than there were a year ago. And I mean, not that it's obviously not a direct comparison, but there is still in the back of my mind of transition from Eastern Washington to the WCC, because we've seen this once before. We saw this in Portland with what we have with Shante Leggins. Like year one, Portland, when he arrived, was really good. Like he brought over a lot of the guys he had at Eastern. They hit the ground running, and everyone's kind of like, oh, this actually might be something. Portland looks like they might be turning around. And then year two, didn't look so great. Year 3 didn't look so great. It kind of took, and we haven't seen them get back anywhere to where they were that first year. So, not to say that obviously that's going to happen here with Washington State, but at the very least, it's something that I just can't get out of my head that, well, we've seen the script once, may not happen again, but there is at least the transition from one league to the next does make a difference. And even though, yes, it's Washington State across the chest, they are still new to this league. That the coach is still new to this league. There's a lot of new still at Washington State, and I think that's something to watch out for in year 2 with this team.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, just to wrap it up real quick, you look at the level of competition. You look at the end of the Pac-12, like pound for pound, there are some teams in the WCC who would make noise. Obviously, it goes without saying, Gonzaga, St. Mary's, but USF, Santa Clara. In those last few years, the Pac-12, they can and would have made a difference in certain respects. And you look at the mention of the crest going across. David Riley, step up in competition. Staff, step up in competition. Players, step up in competition. So there's a lot of adjustment period because you don't get any breaks facing St. Mary's or Gonzaga. You don't get caught up like the new kid on the block. If anything, they probably want to beat you more because you were the Pac-12, and now you think, oh, we're going to the WCC, so we're just going to go run this. And then you see, go ask Oregon State, Washington State if they've been running it in basketball. And they, on the women's side, they've been doing good, but on the men's side, a lot more of a struggle. And I think that's one thing you really want to go check because there will be teams that go make you check yourself. And I think Washington State has to make sure that they can get out the other side of checking themselves because last year they let go of the rope, and this year I think they'll do a better job at it.
Well, you say not letting go of the rope, but the schedule is maybe where we run into a challenge because Washington State, they did a really good job of scheduling. They're in the Maui Invitational. They've got a lot of really good non-conference opponents outside of that. And it almost leads me to, as we continue to have the conversation about what this team is and what they could be, did they maybe put themselves in a position that's going to snowball on them more quickly than it may have otherwise? Because looking at it, yes, they started out with Idaho, but then they have Davidson on the road. They bring in St. Thomas. They play Washington, Southern Utah. Then they go to the Maui. They start with Chaminade, but then it's Arizona State or Texas. Then they could end up with NC State or USC, Boise. They have Bradley. They have Nevada, USC. And there's a lot of teams in here that are going to be top 50 teams, and it's going to come at them fast. And this is where I'm almost concerned that because they're still learning a system, because they're still trying to figure it out, because they may not have all of the right pieces for what they want to do, that it's going to catch up with them quickly. Where last year they were able to really they really played well early on and they kept that going because the competition I don't think it was as good last year as it was this year. Nevada game aside, but I look at this non-conference and I just think by the time we get to the Maui, it could be danger zone for the Cougs.
I do think it's important to, I guess, contextualize danger zone in terms of what? Like, if you're saying in terms of NCAA tournament, I don't think they're making the
No, not. And then I don't think we're discussing Washington State as a tournament team.
Yeah. So in that case, I think danger zone, but danger zone, I think to me more kind of reads of, are you going to be better than last year's team? So when and you play Washington, can you find a way to that's a home game. That's one where you obviously the fan base and the alumni base wants that game. You could see it obviously on the football side. Didn't happen. But in basketball side, that's a Washington team that's very gettable. You look at the forgettable season that Danny Sprinkle had last year. Now you can see is Washington good enough? So Washington State and Washington, I think, is a good fork in the road game for them. At Davidson, obviously tough road game for considering the stature of that program. Maui Invitational, obviously punching above their weight in certain respects. At USC, a team where usually Eric Musselman starts to figure it out around this time, and a tough, right after the opening stretch of conference play, they're kind of a murderer's row of games for Washington State, and the one I kind of want to focus on before I kind of wrap up my big picture thoughts about it. starting January 10th and going through January 18th, and 1 week of games. And you guys at home can let me know if you'd sign up for that. Sounds fun. Let me. Where do I sign? But yeah, no, like that is a very hard stretch of games, and one where it's like, oh my God, you're going to find out pretty quickly what this Washington State team is made of. And even towards the back half of the season, from February 3rd through February 22nd, at Oregon State, hosting Santa Clara, at Gonzaga, hosting Pacific, then hosting St. Mary's. So another tough stretch of games. So I look at Washington State. For me, danger zone time to me is more towards conference play, because I think we'll know more about them. I think they kind of need to take a punch or two in non-conference play, because you need to find out what this team is. I think last year you could kind of see eventually at a certain point the wheels fell off just because of the injuries and all that. Now you kind of got to see what type of program do you have? What type of culture do you have? I think non-conference will teach us a lot about what Washington State's culture is. I think at conference play, you'll kind of get to see, have I seen what I need to see from the Cougars this year in terms of, can they hold their own, or are they just not going to be competitive in their WCC history?
Yeah, this is going to be a much larger challenge this year than it was last year for Washington State. I do think, we've talked kind of a bit about just how the middle of the WCC, while there are a ton of questions, does seem like the talent level has risen up. And whether that be with Santa Clara, with Oregon State, with LMU, with Seattle joining in, even though the non-conference for Seattle is not to be desired, the talent on the team is something that has obviously raised enough eyebrows that you have to pay attention to what the Red Hawks have done. And this Washington State team, this schedule, I think it's going to provide maybe a few more challenges than I think maybe they wanted initially. I mean, again, I think if you gave this schedule to last year's team and they did the exact same thing that they did, we would have been talking very much that Washington State is on that bubble, if not on the actual right side of the bubble, by the time conference play started. Obviously, injuries would have taken them out of the equation anyway later on. But at the moment, this is a schedule they could have really done some legit damage and were capable of pulling off. I think it just feels like that this was almost like a year too late for the schedule.
Yeah, in certain respects, I totally get it. And I think it's hard to project these things knowing how college basketball changes from a year-to-year basis. But I think Washington State, it's a challenge. I personally like scheduling up. I like seeing teams that challenge themselves. Yeah, I like trying to find out what you are through adversity. You look at the schedules of the last years with USF and Santa Clara and how they've continued that momentum. Gonzaga, even though we have raised a lot of questions about them, they're challenged themselves. And that's why we were so hard on St. Mary's. That's why we're hard on Seattle. And that's why when you look at the Washington State schedule, I personally like it because I want to see what they're made of. So yes, it may not be sexy in the win-loss column, and it may be tougher when you look down the road of what you want Washington State basketball to be. But sometimes it's not about what you want, it's what you need. And I think Washington State needs this type of schedule to find out if they have more mental toughness than last year's team.
And you know what? It may actually set themselves up well when, again, you start to think forward about the new Pac-12 and what that's going to look like, and them prepping for a year where they're going to see one of the better basketball conferences in the country when that comes all together. So thinking about the ceiling, thinking about the floor of this team, the more and more I start to think about this, I'm like, the ceiling to me, I don't know if I can go any higher than 6th for this team. When I think about the rest of the league and what they have all done to this point, I don't know if Washington State has done enough on paper. Again, it's all on paper right now, but I don't think that they've done enough to make me believe they would finish any higher than that.
Honestly, I think the more pertinent question is what's their floor? Because we talked about last year, their floor fell out. It just did. I'd be curious to see how you kind of visualize that, because we've talked about it so much ad nauseum that this mid-pack is going to be so compact. Is their floor maybe a little bit lower just by virtue of what the competition is, and maybe how you kind of see that playing out?
I think we could be looking at 9 or 10 as the floor for this team. Again, we're thinking worst case scenario.
Right.
Is this, and because that means worst case scenario is Pacific hits it all. Like they go gangbusters in conference play, and Pacific is actually like legit in the middle of the pack. That assumes San Diego also does what we think they are capable of doing. That means that LMU has done more damage than, maybe not more than, but probably the appropriate amount of damage that we think that LMU is capable of doing. Oregon State has kind of been about where we thought they would be. Santa Clara, same thing. The top three have done what the top three are going to do. It's everybody else has hit on what we thought. If everyone else hits on what we think they're capable of doing on the average, on the aggregate, Washington State could be the one that sees themselves at 8, 9, or 10 in this league.
I'm going to take a different approach, and maybe that's a little bit, maybe it's misguided based on what I've been saying, but to me, the floor was so ugly last year in terms of how Washington State let the bottom fall out that I don't think it can repeat itself this year. Because I think then you start raising big picture questions of like, do we have the right coaching staff if you see something like that fall again, especially if injuries are not a part of the game like they were last year. For me, I have their range a lot smaller. I have their floor is like 8th again, like or not again, sorry, not again, but 8th can be that 8th can be the area. I think if you look for their aggression, I think it'll be more in terms of talent than opposed to circumstance. But I look at the floor, I don't think it's dramatically high. I think 5th place is their ceiling in this league. I just think, to me, if they're going to have the bottom fall out, you've already kind of seen it in action with more talented guys. So I think, and you saw they still finished with the 6th seed anyway in the conference tournament. I think going forward, I think Washington State can be better than that. I think their floor talent, despite what may happen, should be a little bit higher than teams like San Diego Pacific. So even while they may hit and be better, I think Washington State can still be just a smidge more successful in that regard. But I just don't think their ceiling's that high compared to relative other scopes of teams. Like we talked about San Diego, your variance was pretty high on them. Mine was also pretty high. But I think, to me, Washington State's a little bit more compact, a little bit more of a known quantity. I just think we just kind of got to figure out what type of toughness this team really has.
Yeah, and obviously time is going to tell what we see with this Washington State team. There's a lot of variance. There's a lot of interesting pieces. It's a matter of how this is all going to coalesce. What's it going to look like in David Riley's system, and how much the schedule really what direction the schedule really takes them in the non-conference. And by the time they get the WCC play, if they can survive that murderer's row there in January, they can come out the other side floating. I think that then we're probably looking more at the best case scenario for Washington State